ערב טוב, טוב לראות את כולם. אני לא רוצה להשאיר את אלון באנגלית שלו, אז ברשותכם אני אעבור לאנגלית.
זה יהיה דווקא רע מאוד, כי אז ישבו את האנגלית שלך ולאנגלית שלי, זה לא
בסדר. So I don't know what's more exciting from tonight for me, to find out that President Herzog quoted my book, or that Professor Alon Harel has called me a prophet on tape. It's fantastic. I'm very, very touched by this evening, and I so appreciate all the speakers and everybody who came out. I appreciate my colleague and my Yedid Nefesh, Benny Parat, who's also a recent grandfather. He doesn't have enough to do this week, but also involved here, and to Luba for arranging this wonderful evening. And I'm sort of tempted to just speak about all the speakers, what they mean to me on a personal level. Maybe this is not the right forum, but each one of them I look up to a lot, and I learn from a lot, and I force them, each one, to discuss my work with me and to make it better. And for me, this is some of the payoff to just listen to their reflections and to continue to learn from them. It's interesting that the evening has gone in the direction of a lot of contemporary stuff, but let me begin with Chaim Shapira. I'll begin with the more bread and butter, the meat and potatoes of the book, which is rabbinic and Second Temple, but Chaim focused more on the rabbinic, so let me begin there, and I always learn a lot.
Mixed metaphor, bread and butter, right. And meat and potatoes.
There you go. I'll leave it to you to parse. There's a lot of things to parse. I don't know, Professor Harvey, if you check how many times Shapira is quoted in the index. He does better than the Rambam. I don't know how it lines up with the Ran. It might be pretty close.
He's not medieval figures.
But I definitely always learn a lot from Chaim's work, and I told him at one point he had a very important article and it didn't come out before it was chutzpah. He should have rushed it, so it could have been in the book and improved it. Let me just make a few comments about some of the things he said, because I think they are important. Comments on my account of that when you go through all these rabbinic texts, I do try to piece them together to give some larger portrait, but I think Chaim made the interesting observation that methodologically I look at each text and then I try to see, can we tease out a larger account that is dominant. And here I do try to talk about the institutional framing of justice, and I do think that is not obvious. I think there are other voices in rabbinic literature that speak about a court that's dominated by individuals, or dominated by priests, or dominated by a king in theory, or dominated by a political figure, and yet the rabbis have an institutional framing. And this is something that I argue in the book, and I continue to see in various ways, sometimes I think more explicit and sometimes more subtle. I'll just give an example of maybe a more debatable example that has recently caught my attention. I've been poring over the beginning of Pirkei Avot, and it's very interesting that the figure of Shimon HaTzadik, who also famously appears in Ben Sira at the very end of Ben Sira. Ben Sira, he's described as a high priest. And in Chazal, people have pointed out he's not described as a high priest, but Shimon HaTzadik and a Chacham. And that's an important observation that others have made. But I feel like what has been less appreciated is that in the beginning of Pirkei Avot, he's described as Mishayarei Knesset Hagdolah. So he's not just a Chacham, but he's a Chacham with an institutional identity. Of course, you dig deeper into the history, what is Anshe Knesset HaGedolah? How much is that a historical institution, or is it a certain abstraction? You realize how the plot thickens, and even if there's certain pieces of history, maybe in Nehemiah, in the latter chapters, there's a certain abstracting out and an institutional imaginary, I would argue, and it's important to place this Chacham as part of the institution, and I would argue, although in the later redactional phase, I think that enters into the beginning of Avot, So then all of the Chachamim, in some sense, are continuing an institutional project and not just individual projects. So that's an example of how I think this insight, once you notice it, you see it lurking in various places. The interplay between the history and the imaginary is very subtle and complicated. And I agree with Chaim that you always have to operate on both spheres, thinking about the context and the history and the realia, but realizing that when the rabbis in these texts speak, they speak at least in certain texts, in a way that abstracts out and imagines. Even Chaim's excellent recent article about Dinei Nefashot and capital punishment, where Chaim argues there's an evolution in rabbinic texts, in Tannaitic texts, that originally, the argument, I'll just summarize the fascinating Chaim argument, that originally and maybe historically capital punishment was only a part of the jurisdiction of the central court or the Jerusalem court, but over time it was included in the jurisdiction of satellite courts, or courts of 23. But then Chaim runs into the problem, was this reality? By the time this development happened, courts didn't really have that kind of jurisdiction. And Chaim, too, argues, well, this is a historical development in the imaginary of the sages. And I think we always have to operate on both planes. And this, I do think, is an advancing over the Gedolim, humbly, we suggest, I think, of prior generations who tended to read this material more historically, more positivistically, and less, I think, picking up on its hermeneutics, on its polemics, and on its idealization. And that's, I think, a contribution that we all have. I do think Chaim and I sometimes have debates about where to locate any one given text. Is this text more history? Is it more imaginary? And what's the interplay between them? Is this text discrete and should we read it in an atomized way, or should we harmonize? I just mentioned to him before we started speaking that I'm about to present something about Masechet Horayot, and in Horayot it's very interesting that the Mishnah talks about courts of the tribes. And while you find certain parallels to that, both in the Sifrei and in the first chapter of Masechet Rosh Hashanah, I think the overall impression you get in Horayot is that you have a central court and tribal courts. And that text, to me, does not align with what we know from these other texts. And that is a puzzle for the choker, for the researcher. What do you do with that? Do you somehow harmonize that text with other accounts? Or do you say, here's a glimpse of a vision that we only know in a few texts, and it actually is in subtle ways distinct and different from other texts. Maybe it's deriving from hermeneutics. Just for example, for 1 second on there, it's interesting that in Vayikra Dalet, a source text for Horayot, the figure of Nasi comes up. Maybe Nasi was originally a tribal figure, so therefore the tribes are on the radar. Who knows? I mean, I wouldn't say who knows. Obviously, if I was writing on that, I would try to explore that more. But to gloss over it and to just harmonize it, I think has risks. So I accept the pushback on chapter 7 only. No, Chaim did not push back on the other chapters. But even in chapter 7, I think it's a challenge.
It was limited on time.
Yeah, you're limited on time. But I do think we have important common assumptions and then some differences, and I think that's hopefully a value to those readers and students to try to figure out where they come out on the side of the ledger, or are there other approaches that we still have to develop. Let me get a little to some of the modern issues that were raised by basically all the other speakers. Julie, who started with Dubnov, that's a great passage. I'm a little upset you didn't tell me that before I published the text, because it's very relevant. How much is it diasporic or not? You know, in my book, I try to push against the idea that it's all a reaction to less power. maybe I overstated that case because I didn't want to just fall into that trap of, oh, okay, rabbis or other figures had no power, so what alternative did they have? So I think that's too flat, that's too simplistic, it's too much of a genetic fallacy to just reduce it in that way. But of course, less power, my friend and colleague Yair Furstenberg doesn't like the word disempowered, he told me, and I accept the pushback. There are degrees of power. But lesser power might fuel the imaginary to think in other places, and I accept that. I just don't think that's the totality of the story. In terms of what's going on in the present, I got an email about half a year ago, or in January, from Eric Nelson from Harvard. And he said, I hope everybody at the demonstrations are carrying copies of your book. Only a professor at Harvard could even write such a comment, but I'm all for it. But more specific to your comment, I went to the rally in Tel Aviv this Saturday night with my friends Dov Weiss and my new friend Will Bord, who's a professor of constitutional law at Chicago. And this was his first time. William Bord, am I pronouncing his name well? He was here in Tel Aviv, and we went to the rally together. I just met him, and it was very interesting. His reaction right away is, why are the anti-reform people chanting democracy? Their argument is not democracy. Their argument is rule of law, and not democracy. And that was an interesting reaction from a Commonwealth scholar coming from America. Now, I'm not sure that's the end of the story, but I think it's right that democracy is a little bit of a simplistic label. It works well, of course, in rallies. But I agree overall that if you want to limit the democratic, I'm with you, just to put it out there, since we're all putting it out there, that I, of course, have a lot of problems with reform too, but just leaning on democracy is an incomplete account. And ideally, you want to articulate a better account in more stable times. Of course, it's always interesting coming as an American to Israel, because in America, the politics are just at a different place. The court is just more representing right-wing voices, so that leads to different pushback. 1960s is not 2023 in America, and in Israel, Israel's in its own place. And that, of course, leads to different reactions, whether you're pro-court, against court, which makes you sort of wonder how much the court ultimately does get politicized, which is a good segue, I think, to Professor Harvey's comments, or where I would think about the Ron in terms of contemporary issues, in addition to all the things I've learned from Professor Harvey. I just want to actually begin with a comment on the Ron being in the footnotes some 30 times, or in the body, and the Rambam is not there. So I won't date
my criticism of the Rambam.
No, that's fine. I just want to point out that a long, long time ago, I was a student of Professor Harvey in a seminar on Drashot Haran. So it's Professor Harvey who first introduced me to the Ran, and maybe had I taken Mara Nevuchim with Professor Harvey, there would have been a little more Rambam in the book. No, the truth is, I felt overwhelmed by trying to cover Second Temple and Rabbinic, and I just didn't have the space to deal with medieval, but I agree with your account that in medieval, no doubt, the Ran is the most important figure, and if a shorthand way to describe the project of this book to insiders is the Ran before the Ran. Rasha Yud Aleph before the Ran. Thoughts on the roles of the king and of the courts in Second Temple and rabbinic literatures before the Ran schematized it and gave his powerful medieval account. Just the main argument I do make about the Ran in the book, and just very briefly, at the end is I say that the Ran, as Professor Harvey said, returns to the discourse of the king, or invites the king back into the legal system or the legal scheme, because the rule of law is autonomous enough and firmly enough established. So what I'm saying is the hard work early on, if one can abstract out for Second Temple thinkers or rabbinic thinkers, is to ground an autonomous judiciary. By the time you get to medieval times, the halakha is so flourishing and so autonomous that a more mature system can now ask, where is the role of political figures within the legal scheme? And if there's a lesson here, the lesson would be that when we have a mature judiciary, maybe then we could invite back in political interventions into the legal system. So the lesson, and I'm very hesitant to learn a lesson about contemporary times, but in Israel, where it took a long time for the judiciary to have a more prominent role and to be seen as the central address for legal matters, that project is still ongoing. So to have a return of political figures to encroach on the jurisdiction of the court and to take on more of a say, to me, is more dangerous at this point. And maybe over time, when you have a court that's more firmly established for a long period of time, then we could think of ways to contract the jurisdiction to a degree. And that gets me to Alon Harel. And I always, one of the treats here of being in the law school is to run into Alon and to talk ideas with Alon, the ever curious member of our faculty, including about Jewish law. And I could speak on behalf of Benny and myself how much we appreciate always discussing with you issues of Jewish law, and to think about how they interact with larger jurisprudential and political theory questions. In a way, Alon, you're continuing my work, even though you're kindly ascribing it to me. And my work was trying to be descriptive and then to conceptualize the description. I was saying that the rabbinic works take a stand. And the stand is that the rule of law is important, and that leads to a type of separation, and the idea is to safeguard the domain of law. Why safeguard the domain of law? Partially for instrumental reasons. I think you're glossing over that a bit or downplaying it. It is that there's a danger that politics encroaches on the autonomy of law. So I wouldn't dismiss your Rebbe, Raz, altogether. I think he plays a role in this story too. But I do agree that it goes beyond that, and there's something sacred about law, so one should approach it more carefully or make sure it's only assigned to the right guardians, and to protect law as such. And I argue that's a Judaic idea, that's a rabbinic idea, and then I wonder, is that a contemporary idea? And to the extent it is, I'm not necessarily justifying it, I'm describing it. You're kindly trying to give some justifications. Your justifications, to me, are intriguing and worth further pursuing, where you're saying there's a value as such in the domain of law, and for a decision to be made from legal authority and not a political actor, or through reason, but not through will. I guess the challenge then is, how much do the legal institutions live up to that charge? And I think that is a crucial question. I just ran into a reporter who told me they interviewed Justice Aaron Barak, who posed the question, he's probably said this in other accounts, well, what limits the court? And his answer was the law. And that's a compelling answer if it's adhered to. So it's definitely double-edged. On the one hand, it justifies the court's autonomy, but it also demands of the court to live up to that charge.
ערב טוב.